Ending Discrimination and Violence Against Transgender Women of Color by Hari Krishnamurthy. While many believe that LGBT rights are advancing, trans women of color in particular still disproportionately face extreme violence and discrimination. Despite their prominent role in the Stonewall riots and the fight for LGBT equality with activists like Marsha P. Johnson, trans women of color have been left behind in societal acknowledgement of the issues they face. There is still a long way to go in their struggle for equality. In order to decrease the stigma and therefore discrimination against trans women of color, there must be increased awareness of violence against them, positive media representation, and legislative policies promoting their financial independence. To address the issue at hand, there must be better awareness and acknowledgement of how trans women of color are disproportionately victims of violence and discrimination. In Janet Mock's memoir, she contends that transgender women of color are more often the victims of violence or discrimination because society perceives them as being deserving of the violence. Due to the intersection of being transgender, women of color, and often coming from poverty, trans women of color are perceived as less human. Their stories are misconstrued in a way that blames them for the violence they face. It is important for society to acknowledge how trans women of color are targets of violence for simply being who they are and not because they are criminals or trying to trick people. Additionally, many seek to discount the oppression faced by trans women of color by assuming that they hold privileges due to being assigned male at birth. Trans exclusionary radical feminists such as Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie argue that a trans woman is not a woman and that their experiences are characterized by possessing male privilege. Such statements make it appear as if trans women of color who face significantly more violence and discrimination than other groups are somehow privileged because of being assigned male, when this is actually the reason for the violence against them. By arguing that they hold privilege, these activists perpetuate apathy toward the alarming issue of violence against trans women, especially those of color, and take away from societal awareness, which needs to be increased in order to better the situation of trans women of color. Positive media representation can also have a significant impact on decreasing stigma associated with being a trans woman. In the study on their mental health, researchers concluded that increased confidence in gender expression is associated with lower odds of depression in trans women of color. Media representation is one of the key ways to allow for increased expression of transgender identity, making people feel more comfortable in their identity. From my perspective, watching the show Pose about the New York LGBT ballroom scene was the first time I saw trans women of color on screen being depicted in a positive light. One woman mentioned in an editorial from The Guardian how the show Pose liberated her and made her gain confidence in her identity. The show has helped trans women of color claim kinship and community and is a model for future representation, which is imperative to have in order to generate confidence in those who do not feel seen or heard. Additionally, a major cause of discrimination is stigma from portrayal of negative stereotypes in the media. Shows like Pose humanize trans women of color by presenting their stories to a wide audience, helping decrease social stigma and the violence that accompanies this. Another avenue for reducing societal stigma is making trans women of color financially independent, as poverty plays a crucial role in the discrimination against them. The infographic by Human Rights Campaign illustrates the interplay of several factors in increased risk of violence. This is particularly true for trans women of color who face employment discrimination and have to engage in survival sex work that further increases social stigma. Legislative policies are necessary to increase job opportunities for trans women of color through hiring quotas. Some may argue that hiring quotas are unfair, but it is important to understand the history of discrimination based on race and gender identity that makes such policies necessary. Furthermore, legalizing survival sex work will help decriminalize trans women of color who face enormous financial burdens pertaining to medical care and often have to engage in sex work. This will also help to reduce stigma and facilitate wider acceptance and inclusion into society. 2021 was the deadliest year on record for violence against trans women, with the overwhelming majority of the violence being toward trans women of color. It is clear that they face discrimination at multiple levels with intersection of race, gender identity, and poverty. Societal apathy and stigmatization contribute to an increased risk of violence, while they still have to deal with the negative stereotypes and notions with little positive media representation. Broader inclusion and participation in society will require concerted efforts to increase awareness by acknowledging the reality of the epidemic of violence against transgender women of color. Future years should not surpass 2021 as the deadliest year on record for trans women of color. Thank you for listening.